All right. Hello, everyone. I thank you for watching my presentation today on protecting Florida's gentle giants, the rulemaking for the incidental take of the Florida manatee. Quickly, just going over the intended outcomes for the presentation. First one is going to be to outline key information from the EIS framework as it relates specifically to the Florida manatee and this EIS. The next one is to evaluate threats to manatee survival and critical habitats. And then lastly, to explain the role that certain policies, laws, and organizations play in preserving manatees. There's a short video here that kind of lays out the threats and some things that are pertinent to know about the manatee that will kind of help set the stage for our presentation. So here we go.
Manatees are large, gray, aquatic mammals. The average adult manatee is about 10 feet long and weighs between 800 to 1,200 pounds. West Indian manatees are found in the southeastern United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. They're related to the West African manatee, the Amazonian manatee, and the dugong, found in the Indo-Pacific. West Indian manatees live in fresh, brackish, or saltwater, and are herbivores, eating only submerged and emergent aquatic plants, which is probably why they are sometimes called sea cows. They are slow-moving and must surface to breathe air about every 3 to 5 minutes. Manatee mothers have calves about every 2 to 5 years after a 13-month gestation period. Manatee mothers nurse their calves from mammary glands located behind their flippers. Calves stay with their mothers for up to 2 years, learning where to feed and how to find warm water. Manatees actually have very little body fat. They cannot tolerate water temperatures lower than 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius for long periods of time. So in the wintertime, when water temperatures drop, manatees migrate to warm water sources like springs to rest and stay warm. Manatees are listed as a threatened species, and although their population numbers have gone up over the years, they still face many threats. Although manatees have no natural predators, they have other challenges to their survival, such as natural causes like exposure to cold temperatures or disease, watercraft collisions, which can kill or injure manatees, ingesting or entangling in fishing line and litter, exposure to toxic algal blooms, harassment from people, which could lead them into harm's way, and loss of habitat from development, pollution, and more. But there are many people working together to help manatees, and you can help too. Visit SaveTheManatee.org to learn more about manatees and how to help.
Then the next slide, we're just going to talk about the actual EIS. The EIS is titled Rulemaking for Incidental Take of Small Numbers of Florida Manatees, resulting from government programs related to watercraft access and watercraft operation in the state of Florida. The lead agency for the project was the Fish and Wildlife Services, and cooperating agencies included, I didn't mean to put that there, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And later on, we're going to see that there are other actors that contributed comments and whatnot in terms of agencies, but we're going to leave those there for the cooperating agencies. Over to the right is a critical habitat for the Florida manatee, which we will kind of discuss in greater depth later in the presentation, but I did want to show a map of those specific critical habitats, all of which would be impacted by the proposed project. So looking at the legal catalyst, what kind of brought this whole proposal about, there was a lawsuit from, or I guess, Save the Manatee Club sued the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the Army Corps of Engineers, essentially for failing to protect the endangered Florida manatee, and essentially alleging that they violated the Endangered Species Act and NEPA, as well as the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And the parties did reach a settlement in 2001, but there were subsequent disputes, essentially leading to orders that enforced an agreement that required the designation of manatee refuges and sanctuaries. And again, this case was pretty significant because it did, as much as the chicken case, it set that precedence that was already there, obviously, but basically just saying, hey, agencies, you are going to comply with these environmental, laws, and basically do what you can to meet those requirements and ensure manatee protection. So looking at what type of EIS this was actually a programmatic EIS. And what is different about this EIS compared to a typical EIS is that your typical environmental impact statements are for a single specific project. Whereas this one was not. This EIS would be applied to multiple projects across large geographical areas, expediting decisions for these proposed actions, and it would avoid those repetitive analyses to be conducted. So kind of like this umbrella EIS, if you will, because as you can imagine, when they're looking at increasing, infrastructure, including marinas and docks and whatnot, you're going to be impacting the manatees. So what they were specifically trying to change was essentially the rulemaking that is set forth in the MMPA, which prevents the taking of marine animals, which does include manatees, and it also protects their critical habitats. So when we talk about taking, that's kind of the, I guess, politically correct way to say basically you're causing mortality for some of these species. I guess, maybe it sounds better to the public, doesn't make it sound as bad, maybe desensitizes it a little bit, but that's what we're talking about. You can see below that the little diagram there, the specific aspects that this programmatic EIS sought to really impact was boating regulations, so increasing those, coastal development, so that's where we talked about marinas and docks and whatnot, and then obviously how that would impact habitat conservation. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit more in depth here in some later slides. Regarding the format of this particular EIS, it does follow the standard format set forth by the CEQs. So when we look at the purpose and the need for the project, so essentially the project was proposed to legally permit small accidental harm to manatees from activities such as boating and marina construction, and to provide guidelines for federal and private entities to ensure compliance to that MMPA and the ESA. Overall, looking to balance development and conservation and enable waterfront development while protecting the manatee populations, promoting responsible practices, like speed limits and protection zones, hopefully in hopes of mitigating harm to manatees. So looking at Florida, it's really, as you can imagine, the boating, tourism, it's all very, very important to their economy. So, looking to develop more, to increase growth in tourism and jobs and infrastructure. Obviously, anything that they're doing is going to create an impact for those manatees, such as collision risks, boat strikes, contributing to mortality. So we talked about the purpose, fulfilling those legal obligations, but also wanting to promote public participation. And so here we have the actors for the specific project here. Obviously, the lead agency is your U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. The unofficial actors, they really did include essentially everything from other, state agencies, federal agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, Florida State or Fish and Wildlife. Then you have the individual like water management districts that when we looked at that map earlier, all of those critical habitat areas where the manatees really kind of what their habitat range is. So those were also included in there. Those interest groups. So you might have like boaters associations, which as you can imagine would be against boating regulations. You would have other maybe conservation entities. And here we have Save the Manatees. So here you have the agency concerns. So Florida Fish and Wildlife, cited that there would be enforcement challenges and a need for stricter boating speed regulations. And 13 out of the 17 counties don't have speed zones in those critical areas. The Army Corps of Engineers, mentioned balancing conservation and development, which I think essentially is the heart of this EIS, what they were trying to really achieve. And then National Park Service and U.S. Coast Guard, again, they, mentioned that education programs and implementing improved boating regulations is going to be important. And then marine industry and boating associations, we kind of talked about that, discussed kind of the impact of, restrictions on marina development and speed zones. So they're kind of maybe more in opposition. And then you have socioeconomic and legal concerns. Much of their input from the public was mixed. Again, depending on which side of the coin you looked at and where people's interests were. Obviously, there's economic impact, some regulatory uncertainty for boating regulations, and the funding for marine construction. So lots of different impacts and concerns that were raised regarding this EIS. Getting into the project alternatives. So obviously there is the no action alternative, which means that business as usual. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife would take no additional action to authorize incidental take of these manatees under the MMPA. The environmentally preferred alternative would be a negligible impact for these Northwest and Upper St. John River regional populations of manatees, or otherwise called stocks. And it would basically authorize only take of the Northwest and Upper St. John stocks where populations seem to be stable. And I do, as a side note, I should have discussed this image before I started talking about the alternatives, but over on the right, there is this map here that does kind of delineate the areas for each of these stocks or regional populations of manatees. The preferred alternative, so this is what they're really trying to achieve, would expand incidental take of basically your Northwest, Upper St. John, and Atlantic stocks. We look at predicted impacts. So these are ones that the Fish and Wildlife, indicated as the most impactful. And so we've talked about the manatee impacts directly. Increased boat traffic is going to equal more collisions, more boat strikes, increased disturbances just in general for manatees. That stands to reason. Habitat loss. We haven't really touched on this one too much, but as you did see in that video at the beginning, seagrass beds are very, very integral to the conservation of manatees. That they provide a lot of nourishment for them. If you have a loss of those, you're going to see definite impacts to those species. Pollution, again, we saw that in the video as well. Plastic, it could be fuel spills, which from increased boating. Disruption of migration patterns. The habitat for manatees is varied and wide. It's not just one specific place. As the video also mentioned, once the water gets a little cooler, they might move more inland into rivers or these natural springs where the water is warmer. So if there is infrastructure being built, it could really impact those migration patterns. Water quality, again, that's kind of indirect from boat traffic, would be a lot of fuel spills. From construction, you might have turbid water, which obviously can be really impactful as well. Noise impacts, not as well delineated and thought to be as significant of an impact, but still could cause behavioral disturbances in manatees. And then cumulative effects. The document does acknowledge that a lot of these smaller impacts, boating, habitat loss, pollution, it's going to add up to long-term, more significant risks. So they did acknowledge that as well. The description of the affected area. So what are these key areas that the Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, identified as being affected by this project? Specifically, we've talked about a couple of these, but the warm water refuge, it did talk about in the winter, they go to these smaller areas, natural springs, even thermal discharge areas from power plants to avoid hypothermia and that cold stress. So it kind of makes these warmer water refuges ideal aggregation sites for manatees. And we kind of had mentioned too, adding to that warm water refuge, that their habitat range is very wide. They can have open water habitat, so where they can swim freely, and this is more on the coastline, essentially out in the oceans, where they can swim freely and forage. But then obviously kind of going to these other smaller areas in the wintertime, including seagrass beds. So these can be in brackish areas as well as along the coastline. So this is another significantly impacted or affected area, would be those seagrass beds, which provide lots of vegetation for them to eat. Other important habitats, and this is again kind of where we talk about that range of their habitat. They can, inhabit coastal rivers, canals, creeks, lagoons. So, feeding, resting, cavorting, mating, calving, they don't do all of those in the same specific habitat. So making sure that they do have areas that are safe for them and are conserved for those different purposes. And then designated critical habitat. So we haven't really talked too much about the designated critical habitat, but these are specifically identified in the Endangered Species Act to be protected, that ensure survival and recovery, and restrict or limit access to those particular habitats. Habitats that, if they were to become degraded or so damaged, that they don't serve the same purpose anymore, would certainly cause a decrease in the species. So over on the right here, we have just I thought a little table that kind of sums things up pretty nicely here when we talk about the affected area and essentially how large of an area of habitat are we talking here. Public involvement, specifically in terms of environmental conservation, watercraft access, manatee populations, to ensure that all the local communities and the public have a say in the decisions that are impacting the ecosystem. So really, and like I mentioned earlier, 8,000 plus comments. So highly, I guess a lot of is what I'll say, a lot of input and comments. So people having opinions on the matter. And then conservation groups also were involved in the scoping process and provided comments. So obviously Save the Manatee Club, Defenders of Wildlife. And they also want to be involved, not only to ensure conservation, with being balanced with development, but also ensure the legal and regulatory compliance to see if, any additional lawsuits will be warranted in the future. So the rating for the EIS. So for this particular EIS, I was able to find the Environmental Protection Agency's rating for the impact of the action, but not the adequacy of the statement. So here's kind of just a figure on the left here that kind of has the different ratings, with the ones at the top, lack of objections, and a category 1 being where these agencies hope to be in terms of a rating. So this particular rating was rated as a LO, so a lack of objection. I personally think that this assessment does fall short of recognizing the extent of the harm that could be done to manatees for several reasons. I feel that this could weaken the authority of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It's in place for a reason, and this to me seemed kind of like a loophole. Like, well, what kind of go around can we get to get what we want and not have to be so tied to, the incidental take of these species. So, and understanding, obviously a balance, but kind of my thoughts there. And using a programmatic EIS to justify policy changes is not supportive of species protection. So, we have a species that is threatened, and as you can imagine, I'm sure projections, looking at global warming, especially if the seagrass is going to be impacted by global warming or increased human activity, it's going to be problematic for the species. Additionally, it appears to bypass established procedures designed to ensure proper environmental review. As I mentioned earlier, you can have a specific EIS evaluated for projects that could impact manatees to be improved. But this seemed to just be, for lack of better words, kind of a lazy way, a shortcut to basically getting the green light for these projects, that could really harm manatees. And I feel like that case-by-case exceptions is really proper for a species that is so, I guess, easily harmed by human activity is what I'll say. State environmental policy. So Florida does have a FEPA. So just kind of how these all interact here. So the structure shows Florida's environmental governance integrates with state and federal requirements to protect ecosystems during development. So the EIS obviously is a federal document under NEPA. right? Or in this case, if it's specific at the state level, it could be under FEPA to analyze environmental impacts of proposed actions. FEPA is modeled after NEPA, obviously has limited authority, applies primarily to state agency actions that involve development projects. So FEPA also requires environmental assessments for major state agency actions, particularly those that are affecting water resources, wetlands, and wildlife habitats. And it does work alongside with the environmental resource permitting program, which regulates activities that impact surface water, wetlands, and coastal ecosystems, which are all, critical for manatee conservation. So the FEPA does require that environmental assessments at the state level for any project that could harm the habitats, and this could be, dredging, marina construction, coastal development, so anything of that nature. And essentially, it just ensures that state regulations align with these federal protections of under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In addition, and I don't have this on here, there are manatee protection plans, which are adopted at a county level and are integrated into state and federal environmental reviews, also ensuring compliance with FEPA. So kind of how these three intersect and work together to essentially promote conservation and preservation. Looking at the three streams concept. So essentially this particular situation certainly, aligns with this and can easily, these different streams can easily be identified. So the problem stream, simply identifying an issue. So, once it has been, determined, hey, we have this manatee population decline, there are habitat threats, that's our issue, right? And the issue can be brought about, identifying the issue, can be brought about by some focusing event. So a sudden event highlighting the problem. And I have here an example would be the unexpected mortality event in 2021. I know that's fast forward from the time that this EIS was proposed, but just as an example, that could certainly be, a focusing event to highlight a problem. The policy stream or the, proposed solutions. So we have identified this problem. Now we have proposals that, help to solve these issues, such as critical habitat designation to restrict harmful activities, rescue and rehabilitation efforts for manatees facing different threats, educational campaigns to raise awareness, regulations of boat speeds and critical habitats. So those are all examples of these proposed solutions that would be in this policy stream. And then the politics stream addresses the political context, including changes in leadership at state and federal levels. As politics are very polarizing in our country, and typically you do see some topics, depending on who is in office, either being for or against. So certainly plays a huge role in that. Also shifts in public opinions due to, again, it could be high profile, like that unexplained, or that mortality event. So, or even lobbying. So if interest groups are really pushing to lobby, so like environmental organizations, the squeaky wheel gets the grease is kind of a saying that I think is applicable here. The more lobbying that is done, the more likely I think change and can be brought about. So, which leads us to the window of opportunity. So for manatee conservation, typically when there's heightened public concern about manatee deaths or habitat degradation, effective policy solutions have been proposed, and basically the political will aligns with public concern. So it could be driven by more media attention or advocacy groups, or even government priorities. So, for example, we talked about that mass die-off of manatees in 2021, created significant pressure on the state and federal governments to act, leading to more aggressive conservation efforts and discussions around, more protective measures. So clearly see how all of those kind of come in alignment with this particular instance. Contributions to the SDGs, excuse me. The SDGs, obviously life below water. This particular one highlights, obviously manatees, because this particular EIS project proposal does have adverse effects on manatees and the aquatic habitats of the species. So the other two, well, I guess this other one here, peace, justice, and strong institutions, it's not as direct of a connection, certainly an indirect relationship, but a strong focus on peace, justice, and accountability, is crucial for sustainable management of natural resources and the protection of vulnerable species like manatees. So again, yeah, we, having accountability for these institutions, having the respect for natural resources and the rule of the law kind of, I think, falls into this peace, justice, and strong institutions. And without those things, manatee conservation and preservation just isn't going to be as successful. And then partnership for goals. Partnership for goals. Obviously, collaborative efforts with the public. I think manatee preservation is something that is really, really important, regardless, of the IUCN red list designation status. I think because they are so vulnerable to changes, that it's just really, really important that we focus our efforts on this species. So where we stand currently. So on April 4th, and I didn't put the date there, or the year, 2003, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife did withdraw the proposal for this EIS due to over 8,000 public comments and scientific data, basically indicating that this incidental take wouldn't have a negligible impact, meaning that they think the take of this species, if they move forward with this, it would have an even greater impact on those different stocks than they initially thought. Different ones here, the Florida Manatee Sanctuary designates Florida as a sanctuary for manatee. And then there was a Manatee Protection Act of 2025, which designates the West Indian manatee as endangered, so offering highest level of protection. So, and then we just have some organizations and efforts that are currently being done to help preserve and conserve the species and the habitat. So we talked about some of these. We haven't really talked about the Wildlife Federation, but basically they focus on improving water quality, restoring habitats, and educating the public. We've talked briefly about Save the Manatee Club, but as you can see, a lot of these agencies and organizations kind of have similar overlapping roles that they play. Florida Fish and Wildlife does more on the research side, population monitoring, so the science basically behind, I guess they all do science, but kind of at the state level. And then habitat restoration, public awareness, research and monitoring, these are all efforts that are currently done that are really essential to provide information to help preserve the species as well. Challenges, we have the IUCN threatened species status. So the manatee was relisted as vulnerable in 2023, and it was previously listed as endangered. So some improvement there. But mortality is still pretty excessive. We talked about that UME, that unexplained mortality event, for several years here. Over 1,600 manatees died. And as you can see down below here, with the population being less than 8,000 manatees, 1,600 is massive, and most of that was attributed to seagrass loss. So very important to maintain those seagrass beds. Boat strikes. 1 in 4 adults were hit by a boat 10 or more times, and that was from a recent study that was conducted. You can see the different stocks here, and the kind of the wider this gray area, the more the boat strike scars were on these species, so on these particular manatee carcasses that were collected. And then over here, I just have the deaths per stock, so you can kind of see that. And that's been over the past several years. So, yeah. This is a new legal action. The Center for Biological Diversity did sue Fish and Wildlife in more recently for not updating critical habitat and basically violating the Endangered Species Act. So just some more recent, again, things that have occurred. Here's my list of references for the project, and I hope that you learned a little bit about manatees and this particular EIS.